he was found in a glacier, frozen in time for 5,000 years.
In 1991, a melting glacier in the Tyrolean Alps gave up a body frozen for over 5,000 years. At first, Ötzi the Iceman seemed like a perfect time capsule of the Copper Age, as his meals, clothes, and cause of death were preserved in ice.
He's the oldest human specimen we have that is so complete.
He's so well preserved.
He may well be the most studied human being in history.
But now, a cutting-edge DNA study comparing him to his neighbors has cracked open a mystery no one expected. Beneath the frostbitten skin lies a genetic signature unlike anyone then or now.
We figured he was probably Italian. Wrong. Eastern European, North African, wrong, wrong, wrong. Where's this guy from?
Why did this man carry the blood of a vanished people? And could that difference be the reason someone put an arrow in his back? The frozen man who wouldn't let go of his secrets. It was the summer of 1991 when two German hikers strayed off the marked paths in the Tyrolean Alps, near the border between Austria and Italy. They thought they had stumbled upon the remains of a mountaineer lost to the snowstorms of recent decades. The man's body, which was sticking awkwardly out of the melting ice, looked too intact to be ancient. His skin was leathery, his posture strangely stiff, and his belongings half buried in the glacier. But what they had uncovered was no ordinary accident victim. They had stumbled upon a time capsule from more than 5 millennia ago. It was a man frozen in death, yet perfectly preserved. Soon, the world would know him by a chilling nickname, Ötzi the Iceman. When scientists finally brought his body into the lab, they were stunned. Radiocarbon dating placed his death around 3300 BC during Europe's Copper Age. This was a period of dramatic change, when farming communities were learning to work metal, exchange goods over long distances, and build the foundations of societies that would later shape the continent. Yet, here was a single individual, frozen at the exact intersection of survival and innovation, offering scientists a window into that forgotten world. Ötzi's body gave up its secrets slowly, one discovery at a time. His stomach still contained the remnants of his final meal, preserved like evidence sealed in a vault. Inside, researchers found ibex meat, red deer, and einkorn wheat, an ancient grain once harvested across early European farms. The meal suggested not just what he ate, but also how connected he was to his environment. He was a man who hunted the high peaks, yet carried food cultivated in the valleys below. His clothing told another story. He was wrapped in stitched hide garments, made from goat and sheep leather, layered carefully to keep out the bitter Alpine cold. He wore a woven grass cape, a tool against wind and wet, and on his feet were shoes stuffed with grass for insulation, bound with deerskin. This wasn't crude improvisation, but advanced, tailored survival gear. Whoever crafted these clothes was skilled, and Ötzi himself was a man prepared to travel through dangerous terrain. His body wasn't just a corpse, but evidence of how early humans adapted, innovated, and endured in one of the harshest environments on Earth. But the frozen man was far from healthy. As scientists looked deeper, they found the marks of chronic suffering etched into his body. His joints showed signs of arthritis, and his intestines carried parasites that would have caused painful cramps. Genetic analysis revealed that he had Lyme disease. He was in his mid-40s, old for his time, and he carried the weight of a lifetime of hardship. It made him seem suddenly more human, not just an artifact, but a man who had lived with pain, pushed through it, and carried on. Then came the revelation that turned Ötzi's case from fascinating to chilling. He hadn't died peacefully in the mountains. Forensic analysis showed an arrow lodged in his left shoulder, with its flint tip still buried in the bone. It had severed a major artery and bled him out in minutes. Some evidence suggested he may have also suffered a blow to the head, perhaps delivered after he collapsed. Others argued he could have stumbled and fallen after the arrow struck. Either way, his end was violent. He was hunted, attacked, and left to die in the cold, and his body was slowly swallowed by the glacier. And yet, even as scientists pieced together the story of his last days, a larger question loomed. Who had killed him, and why? Was it a robbery? A feud? A clash between communities? The arrow hinted at human conflict, but it said nothing about the people who fired it, or the society that gave rise to such violence. Ötzi's body could tell us how he lived and died, but it remained strangely silent about the world around him and the family, neighbors, and culture that shaped his existence. That silence became the real mystery. If Ötzi was the best preserved individual from the Copper Age, then what about everyone else? His story was just one thread pulled out of a vast and tangled fabric. To truly understand him, scientists realized they needed to look beyond the lone frozen man, into the genes of the people who lived alongside him, that produced him, and the hidden twists his DNA still concealed. The DNA hunt across millennia. For decades, Ötzi the Iceman's skin, his tools, and his last meal told fragments of a story. But fragments were never enough. Scientists wanted to know, who were his people? Where did he truly belong in the tangled web of Europe's deep past? The Institute for Mummy Studies in Bolzano, Italy, took up the challenge, and it was no ordinary project. Their plan was to not only decode Ötzi's DNA, but to set him against the backdrop of his entire world. To do that, they gathered a genetic cast of characters, 47 ancient individuals spanning nearly 5,000 years, from 6,400 to 1300 BC. Among them, 15 lived and died in Ötzi's own time. Together, these samples would form a kind of genetic map that could reveal whether Ötzi was unique or simply another thread in a much larger tapestry. The stakes were high. For centuries, historians have debated the great turning points of European prehistory. After the Ice Age ended around 18,000 years ago, Western hunter-gatherers crept into the Alps, carving out a life in harsh landscapes where glaciers once ruled. But around 7,000 BC, something radical happened. Farmers from Anatolia swept across Europe, bringing seeds, livestock, and new ways of life. When they entered the Alps, their arrival marked nothing short of a cultural revolution. One might expect such a massive migration to erase the old ways entirely, but the DNA told a stranger story. Instead of disappearing, the local hunter-gatherers blended with the newcomers. Their descendants, living high in the Alps by 4800 BC, carried 80 to 90% Anatolian farmer ancestry, and that mix remained unchanged for thousands of years. It was as if the Alps became a genetic island, sealed off from the waves of change rolling across the rest of Europe. This stability defied expectations. Elsewhere, Bronze Age migrations from the Eurasian steppe reshaped entire populations. But in the Alps, time seemed to stand still. Generation after generation, the DNA looked the same, suggesting these mountain communities lived in relative isolation, cut off from the currents of history sweeping through surrounding lands. And yet, this isolation carried its own mysteries. When the scientists ran comparisons against modern DNA, they uncovered a startling connection. Of all Europeans alive today, it was not the Austrians or Northern Italians who stood closest to Ötzi's Alpine neighbors, but the Sardinians. But why Sardinia? Why should an island in the Mediterranean hold the closest living cousins of a man frozen high in the Alps? The answer pointed to something profound about how migrations carved and reshaped Europe. While the Alps froze their populations in place, Sardinia, too, had remained genetically insulated. Both became living time capsules of Europe's first farmers, untouched by later upheavals. But the Bolzano researchers were not satisfied with ancestry alone. DNA, they argued, was more than just a lineage chart. It was a diary, and buried in those strands of code were hints of how people lived, how they moved, and sometimes even how they chose their partners. If they could read that diary, they might learn not just where Ötzi came from, but what kind of society surrounded him. And as they dug deeper into that genetic diary, they would stumble upon revelations no one expected. These findings suggested that Ötzi's world was more complicated and perhaps more isolated than anyone dared to imagine. Society of Ötzi's contemporaries. The DNA of Ötzi's neighbors has opened a window into what kind of world he lived in. And it wasn't random. Patterns jumped out immediately. Most of the men in these alpine valleys carried the same Y chromosome branch, known today as G2AL410. This meant fathers passed the same male lineage down to their sons, generation after generation, with little interruption. Sons didn't often leave their birth villages. They stayed, married, and inherited land or responsibility from their fathers. But women told a different story. When scientists checked the maternal side, the mitochondrial DNA, they found striking diversity. Unlike the men, women often came from elsewhere. They moved between valleys, sometimes from very distant regions, to marry into these Alpine clans. The result was a system where the men anchored their bloodlines in place while women acted like bridges, linking villages and passing on new variations to their children. This structure explains why, for centuries, the paternal lines remained stable while the maternal lines showed far more variety. Stability in the men, mobility in the women. It created a society that was both deeply rooted and connected. And yet, the DNA records also revealed rare breaks in the pattern. Among the remains studied, 2 men stood out that didn't fit the G2AL497 mold. Their ancestry reached beyond the Alps, possibly tracing back to the Eastern Mediterranean or the Caucasus. These outsiders were exceptions and intrusions into the otherwise tight-knit gene pool. How they ended up in these valleys, through trade, travel, or marriage, remains uncertain. But their presence proves that even in a world of genetic continuity, sudden foreign elements could appear. The DNA also gave a clearer picture of daily life. Brown eyes were the norm, and hair ranged from dark brown to black, with skin tones that varied, but generally leaned toward darker shades than the pale Alpine stereotype we might imagine today. These were not the fair-haired mountaineers of legend, and they looked more Mediterranean than Northern European. And their diets were still shifting. The DNA showed no trace of lactose tolerance, meaning none of them could digest milk into adulthood. Dairy simply wasn't part of their lives yet, not the way it would become in later centuries. Their food came from cereals, meat, and gathered plants, with occasional dairy use limited to children. Still, isolation didn't mean stagnation. Archaeology proves that trade flowed in and out of these valleys. Obsidian from far-off volcanic regions, amber from the north, and copper tools from mining centers all ended up in the hands of these Alpine villagers. They weren't cut off, but plugged into larger networks, even while their DNA remained curiously uniform. This was the world of Ötzi, a society stable in its male roots, yet flexible through the movement of women and the pull of distant trade. But as much as he belonged to it, Ötzi was not defined by it. His DNA would soon reveal a twist. He wasn't just another son of the Alps. He was something else entirely. And when scientists finally compared Ötzi's genes to this familiar pattern, the results broke expectations. A man out of place. When scientists compared their findings to Ötzi's genome, they expected him to fit neatly into the picture of Copper Age Europe. At first glance, that seemed to be true. His ancestry showed around 90% coming from early Anatolian farmers, with only about 10% from Europe's older hunter-gatherers. That mix looked normal. But the more researchers dug into the details, the more he began to look like a man out of place. One of the earliest signs came from his paternal line. Ötzi's Y chromosome fell into a rare branch known as GZ6208. This was unusual because men living in his Alpine region at the same time mostly carried a completely different lineage, called L497. If Ötzi had been an ordinary local, his DNA should have matched that pattern. Instead, his father's line set him apart, like a flag from a vanishing tribe. Then came the maternal mystery. His mitochondrial DNA, passed down from his mother, was labeled K1F. That may sound like a simple code, but what it means is chilling. No other human ever found, living or dead, has carried this exact lineage. Not in the Alps, not in wider Europe, and not even in massive databases of modern genomes. It was as if his mother's bloodline had disappeared from history. Some scientists suggested it had died out entirely, leaving Ötzi as one of the last carriers of a vanished family tree. That oddity deepened when researchers looked at his overall ancestry percentages. With 90.5% Anatolian farmer ancestry, Ötzi ranked among the highest of any Copper Age European. At a time when neighboring groups were blending with hunter-gatherers and later steppe herders, his DNA looked unusually pure. It was almost as if he came from a pocket of people who had resisted outside mixing. But if that was true, then his community may have been shrinking, slowly swallowed by waves of newcomers. The more scientists compared him to others in Europe, the more it seemed he was holding on to something that was already fading. His genetic profile looked older, less blended, and more isolated. Instead of standing as an example of the average man of his time, Ötzi was beginning to look like a relic of a lineage on the edge of extinction. And that raised questions. Was he truly from the Alpine valleys where his body was found? Or had he traveled there from a more isolated community tucked away in some forgotten corner of Europe? Could his strange DNA explain why he was found alone, high in the mountains, far from safety? The evidence suggested that Ötzi carried more than just the story of his own life. His blood held the last whispers of an ancient people disappearing from the map. He may not have realized it, but he was one of the final carriers of a world already slipping into memory. And yet, this wasn't just an odd genetic quirk. As new studies revealed, Ötzi's unique DNA was not only rare, but one of a kind, pointing to a deeper twist that could change how we understand his death. Clues from before and after his time. Ötzi's DNA sits as a perfect record of the genetic world he belonged to. But to truly understand what makes him stand out, scientists had to compare him with people who came after. This is where the mystery begins to narrow, pointing toward a startling truth. When researchers looked at Ötzi himself, they expected to see hints of connections to other regions. After all, trade routes already threaded across Europe, carrying stone, copper, and salt. Surely some foreign ancestry must have trickled into his bloodline. But the results gave a different picture. His genome showed no trace of new ancestry from far-off lands. He was deeply rooted either because his community was isolated or because they resisted mixing with others. In a way, Ötzi was as alpine as the mountains that held his frozen body for over 5,000 years. But the story does not end there. After Ötzi's death, around 2400 BC, the Alps saw a wave of newcomers. These migrants came from the Pontic-Caspian steppe, riding horses and bringing bronze tools, herding practices, and a powerful new genetic signal. Within just a few generations, their steppe ancestry made up as much as 1/3 of the DNA in some Alpine individuals. Other traces began to appear as well. Some Alpine skeletons revealed links to the Caucasus and even Iranian Neolithic farmers, suggesting connections that stretched far beyond Europe. Trade routes grew wider, ideas spread faster, and once quiet valleys became part of a much larger web of human movement. The Alps were no longer cut off, and were now a crossroads. And yet, Ötzi was untouched by all of it. His DNA was frozen in an earlier age, showing no hint of steppe ancestry or distant newcomers. He belonged to a world right on the edge of collapse, the final chapter of a people whose genetic identity was about to be swept away. This leaves a haunting impression. Ötzi was alive at the tail end of a genetic tradition that would vanish forever within a few hundred years. He was one of the last of his kind, carrying an unbroken line of ancestry that would soon be lost in the flood of migrations that reshaped Europe, which makes what comes next all the more startling. Because Ötzi's DNA does not just show what he lacked, but hides a twist that sets him apart from everyone else. A twist can give a clue about the mystery of his death. Could this genetic oddity connect to why he was found alone and killed? That possibility leads to the most provocative theory yet. The DNA twist no one saw coming. When researchers unlocked Ötzi's DNA, they expected answers about his health and ancestry. What they found instead was a twist no one could have predicted. Despite living among people who were genetically similar at the population level, Ötzi carried a combination that set him apart completely. His genetic code showed he was one of a kind. The rare paternal line and the entirely unique maternal line combined into something that has never been seen again in any known ancient or modern person. In short, in 5,000 years, there has been no one else like him. This revelation reshaped how experts saw him. It suggested he might not have been a typical Copper Age farmer or herder, but someone with roots that reached beyond the valleys where he died. He may have belonged to a fading community whose bloodline was about to disappear. Or he may have been a traveler who carried genes from another region. Either way, his DNA showed he was different. That difference could explain why his final journey ended so strangely. He died high in the icy mountains, far from any known settlement. The idea that he was an outsider gives weight to the murder theory. History shows us that in small, close-knit groups, someone who stood apart was rarely ignored. Outsiders could be treated as valuable traders, but they could also be distrusted or targeted as threats. If his unique ancestry reflected cultural differences as well, he might have been marked as other. That label could have carried a heavy cost. His death was not natural, as an arrow pierced his back as he moved through the mountains. The scene suggests an ambush, not a random accident. The location only deepens the mystery. Why was he climbing through a dangerous pass, alone, and far from any safety? Now, with this DNA twist, the question becomes more than who killed him. It becomes why. Was he chased out because he was different? Was he hunted for political reasons? Or because he carried knowledge, goods or secrets others wanted? Or was his unique bloodline itself the very reason someone decided he could not remain alive? So how can this DNA twist begin to solve a murder mystery that has haunted us for 5,000 years? The genetic clues to a prehistoric murder. For centuries, the story of Ötzi the Iceman's death has been told as one of the great murder mysteries of prehistory. The common theories spoke of robbery, a feud, or perhaps a random attack on a traveler caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. But new DNA analysis has added an unsettling layer to the mystery. Now that we know his genetic code carries traces that set him apart from the people who lived in the same region, that difference changes how we look at his final hours. If Ötzi was not a local, then he may have carried the mark of an outsider, someone whose very presence was enough to spark suspicion. In small mountain communities where survival depended on trust and familiarity, a man who looked or spoke differently, who carried rare tools or foreign goods, could be seen as a threat. His rare DNA that did not match the patterns of his neighbors points toward this idea. He may have been identified as the other, and in the harsh world of prehistory, that alone could be fatal. There is also the chilling thought of a fading people. DNA shows that Ötzi carried a lineage that was slowly vanishing, swallowed up by newer populations moving into Europe. Was he one of the last remnants of a group whose numbers had thinned? If so, his death might not have been random at all. He may have been considered expendable as a man with no tribe powerful enough to protect him. In societies where alliances meant life and survival, a lonely traveler from a dying people could be an easy target for violence. His belongings also raised the specter of trade rivalry. Ötzi's copper axe was far ahead of its time. It was a valuable object that may have marked him as either a trader or a man with dangerous connections. Copper was rare and sought after, and carrying it through contested mountain routes could have painted a target on his back. The DNA study suggests he may have traveled more widely than most. Each crossing into new valleys or regions could have exposed him to rival groups who saw him not as a neighbor, but as competition. To kill him was to strike at the networks of trade that gave him power. There is also the possibility of a targeted killing. In small, resource-starved societies, rules were simple and brutal. An outsider might be killed not because of a crime, but because he simply did not belong. A look, a suspicion, or the fear of what he might bring into their world could be enough reason. The arrow in his back tells of a swift and merciless end, the kind given to a stranger with no right of defense. But perhaps darker forces were at play. The difference in his DNA raises a haunting question. Could Ötzi's death have been a ritual act? Prehistoric communities often performed sacrifices to secure the favor of gods or spirits. To kill someone marked as different with a different bloodline might have carried symbolic meaning. He might not have just been a victim of violence, but an unlucky figure used in a ritual meant to bind a community together through the death of an other. The most chilling part is that his DNA may be the last voice of a vanished people. His genetic markers do not fully match those of later populations, suggesting a lineage that disappeared after him. That final trace makes his killing feel less like an isolated act and more like the silencing of a bloodline. When he fell into the snow and died, so too may have ended the story of an entire group of people. The frozen body, the copper axe, the arrow wound, and now the DNA all circle back to one terrifying truth. Ötzi's murder may have been more than a simple crime. It may have been the inevitable fate of a man marked by difference, carrying in his very blood the reason why others decided he should not live. His DNA, preserved for 5,000 years, tells a story of suspicion and perhaps hatred. It is the coldest clue of all, suggesting that one of the earliest known murders was not just about survival, but about identity. And in the end, it was that identity that sealed Ötzi's doom. What do you think about this discovery? Feel free to share your thoughts with us in the comments section. Want more videos like this? Then subscribe to the channel for more eye-opening stories. Thank you so much for staying with us till the end. See you in the next video.